My buddy Kyle Idleman has been a voice in my life for many years, as he has been for many, many readers of his incredible books. He planted Real Life Church in the year 2001, then handed me the keys, and I had the opportunity to run it for 20 years. Over those 20 years, he and I became good friends, and I'm anxious for you to hear my conversation with author and pastor Kyle Idleman. Thank you for finally being on the podcast. I can't believe we've done this many episodes and not been able to pull this together for you and I. I mean, the time zone thing really messed us up. So
yeah. And by pull this together, you mean you get around to inviting me on?
Well, I wasn't going to say it that way, but I had some issues to deal with. But seriously, I had to laugh because your assistant would always say, How about 9 a.m. for us? And I'd say, well, that's 6 a.m. for us, so I'm not doing that. But hey, tell us about yourself for our listeners that don't know who you are. Give us, Kyle, in 90 seconds, where you're from and what you do.
Sure. So I grew up in a town that you know well, Rusty, Joplin, Missouri. There's a surprising amount of us that are from Joplin. And so that's my hometown, small town in Missouri that I kind of grew up as a pastor's kid a little bit. My dad was the president of the seminary, the Bible college that you and I both went to. But it had a little bit of that pastor kid feel to it. And so my parents I grew up with my parents encouraging ministry, but never kind of putting any pressure on me to go that direction. And I graduated from high school, and if you would have asked me what do I not want to do, I would have said, I don't want to be a preacher. Like I don't want to be a pastor. Mm-hmm. But that sometimes has a way of going the opposite direction. You think it will, has a way of testing God a little bit, I think. And he knew what the plan was. I was a freshman in college when I started preaching at this church called Christ Church of Perseverance. Have you ever heard of that?
What town was that in?
It was outside Carthage, Missouri. It's about 15 minutes from where we went to school. And it is called Christ Church of Perseverance because it required some perseverance. I mean, there were like 30 people that went to this church, and they asked me to preach on a Sunday to fill in. Did you ever do that?
Yeah. Every weekend.
And they said they'd pay me $50. And I'm like, well, I'll do it for $50. And I was like 19 at the time. And I got done with that sermon, and they said, hey, do you want to come back next week and do that? I'm like, yeah, I'll come back next week. And they like, you want to come back next week? And I'm like, yeah, I'll come back next week. And then like maybe 5 or 6 weeks into it, I walked out of the sanctuary, and in the lobby, on the bulletin board, there was this piece of paper that said Kyle Idleman, senior minister. And they never asked me about it. Like there was never any discussion. It just kind of got assumed. And I, in some ways that calling for me was exactly what I needed. Like God tricked me into it a little bit because I was resistant to it. And he opened that door for me there. And I ended up loving it, fell in love with caring for and pastoring those people, fell in love with preaching. My wife and I got married while we were in school, and then we moved out to where you are. So I came out there in after I graduated from college, 98, 99, and we had one child at the time, and worked with Shepherd of the Hills there, and then with helping to start Real Life. And then we moved out here at the end of 2002 to Southeast in Louisville, Kentucky, where I'm at now. We have 4 kids. Got 2 of my kids who are married. And I love my son-in-laws, which is awesome. I did not know that was going to happen. So I'm really grateful for that. My oldest 2 girls are married. And then I have one daughter who's serving God in South Africa. And then my son is 17, and he's going to graduate next year.
Wow. That is so exciting. Okay. So, man, so much stuff to dig into here. I want to go back to your days at Christ Church of Perseverance. Was that the name of the city? Is that how they got that term?
No, I don't know. I suppose, perhaps because perseverance is a biblical word. However, I've never heard it used in the title of a church before.
No, it sounds more like a Catholic church or something. So, any funny stories from those little churches? I know when I taught in Dexter, Kansas, Anderson, Missouri. Yes. Collins, Missouri. I don't know if you ever did that one as well. You just ran into the nicest people and yet the oddest people at times with some of the things that they would talk about or say or expect.
And then you find out that they're related in some weird way.
Oh, everyone's related, absolutely. Or had some kind of falling out over a piece of land or a cow. So those were great stories.
I found out in my job description for that, I was to preach on the weekends, and then I was to mow the grass. So I preached, I mowed the grass, and in some ways that was great training, right? Like for ministry and keeping the focus on serving. My favorite moment was on a weekend. We would sing a happy birthday song, kind of a Christian version of Happy Birthday. We would do it every weekend, and after we would sing it, we would say, "Is it anybody's birthday?" Recognized. And so I suggested, I'm like, hey, what if we asked if it was someone's birthday first? And if it is someone's birthday, then we sing the song. But if it's not, let's not sing the song. Let's ask first. And that was voted down. So yeah.
I'm sure that caused a lot of consternation there amongst the board.
Birthday songs and then pledging allegiance to the flags, the whole thing.
Yes, yeah, and the Bible. Mm-hmm. Oh, my goodness. That's really good. I remember in Dexter that I don't know what happened, but somebody wanted to get baptized. So apparently they were new to the family. And which was very exciting. And so they had a baptistry, but we had to clean out all the Christmas decorations that were stored in it so we could baptize this woman, which they filled with a garden hose. So it was crisp that day.
Yeah, it was. With some glitter floating around in it.
Of course, yeah. A little bit of mistletoe. Well, obviously, you felt this call to go out to California, and a lot of our listeners are church planners. Tell me about why California? I mean, did you just feel like your heart was breaking for planning a church out there? Did somebody talk you into it? Did Dudley have dirt on you? I mean, how did you get to, a kid from Joplin, Missouri, who didn't want to be a preacher, decides to plant a church in California?
Well, I didn't know anything about church planting. If I had, I probably would not have had the confidence to do it. It was one of those situations where, your naivete works to your benefit. Because I didn't know what I didn't know, and it definitely gave me a false sense of confidence. To put some scripture with that, though, as Paul says to the Corinthians, God's strength is made perfect in weakness, and He chooses the weak things, and I think that was definitely true. He had plenty of opportunities to demonstrate that, and I didn't know much about church planting because I don't think at that time there was as much of a movement around it where you could go to a conference or read a book. I'm sure there were church planting books. I hadn't been exposed to that, and so I knew I wanted to preach, and I knew I didn't want to be a student pastor. Like I knew I wouldn't do very well with that, and so I thought, well, I'll plant a church because no one was going to hire me to be a pastor or preacher. I was like 23 and so I had that connection with Dudley and Shepherd of the Hills Church, and I knew I understood intuitively how important it would be to be in an area that had was a really growing area that needed a church. And so at that time, the Santa Clarita Valley was growing tremendously, and it's continued to. But I recognized that, hey, this would be a great opportunity to plant a church in an area where there's a need, and God opened up the doors and kind of put it together. But I I didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah, I think that's a wise statement and a good statement, and it's a good thing for most church planners, because if you know what you're getting into, you typically back out. I've never understood the people that plant multiple churches. These are the people that have decided, I am a glutton for punishment, because it's difficult. And I often thank you, whether you know it or not, for having done this, because I thought I might be interested in planning a church. You and I had lunch. I don't know if you remember this. We were both speaking at Preaching and Teaching Convention in Joplin, and I was working in Kentucky. You were planted this church out in California. We went to some Chinese food place there in Joplin, which is where Chinese food is best.
Yeah.
And I said, so tell me about planting a church, because I thought I wanted to do it. And little did I know, you did the heavy lifting, and I got to come in and take it from there. And I think, boy, I could not have done that.
Well,
what you did was perfect.
I would consider us to be co-planters in real life church, because you came into it, and I was not in that role very long, and you came in when we were really starting to do some of the hard work. We were meeting in a movie theater, and we're just getting some of our lay leaders established, just kind of finding our footing a little bit. And and I think God ordained that lunch, because that put on my radar that, this is something that you would be interested in. And I felt such tremendous relief. I had prayed so much about, I hear church planners sometimes talk about, when you start a church, it feels a little bit like a child. It's and I related to that, especially at the time we just had our third daughter, and it felt like the church was a child, where you're just concerned about it being cared for. And I just remember literally crying with relief when God called you to it. And really, and I can see much more clearly in hindsight that, your strengths for that season were exactly what the church needed. Like, it's his child. It's not ours. It's not mine. It's and so it's fun in hindsight to see how well he took care of his church.
Well, I think that is the great, leveler for all of us when it comes to our expectations. And it's been so great for me to know, hey, this was going before I got here, and it'll be going after I'm gone. So I'll do what I can with it. And I think that reminds us how it really is God's church. So tell me about, you had just one of the most unique experiences in that you came out to a great, thriving church at Shepherd of the Hills, and Dudley gave you such great permission to teach, to build relationships, and to take whoever you wanted. Dudley's been on the podcast. We had him on for our 20th anniversary as a church, and you were kind enough to share some things on our weekend service as well. But I just remember thinking, not many pastors who plant churches out of their church are as open-handed as Dudley was. How did that relationship start, and then how did real life kind of begin out of Shepherd of the Hills? Because I think this is really great for pastors who are wanting churches to be planted from them, because he did it the right way.
Well, the two things about Dudley is that he is incredibly generous, and he is very much an evangelist. He is very generous, and he loves to win people to Jesus. And those two things came together for my benefit. Because he was just incredibly generous, and to use your language, of open-handed. I remember coming there. I would have been like 22 when I first got there, and he said, "Hey, whatever you need, feel free to shoulder tap whoever you want to. Nobody is off limits. If you want to try to encourage, our best leaders to come with you, then go for it." And so he was incredibly generous that way. And then, he has helped me over the years be much more intentional with evangelism and reaching people who, don't know Jesus, who don't have a church home. So those qualities are, for a church that's trying to start a church 30 minutes down the road, that's huge. And he was humble. He shared, again, I was a kid, and he let me get up there to preach at Shepherd on the Hills on a regular basis and tell everybody at the church, hey, here's what I'm doing. Love to have you come with me. I took all of that for granted at the time. I'm like, well, of course, this is what senior pastors do. Yeah. And I didn't realize how rare that is, but yeah, he was very gracious that way.
One of my favorite stories you tell is about, because Dudley is known for a little bit of theatrics at times, if needed, to prove a point. Mm-hmm. And I love the story you tell about how he gave you an example of what he did not want to see happen after the church began. Can you share that story with us?
Yes, I don't know that I've done this publicly, but I would be glad to. So when I got there, he was on sabbatical, and I wasn't sure what to do. So I literally sat in my office and played video games because I had no idea where to start or what to do. And I thought, well, when he gets back from his sabbatical, he'll tell me what I need to do to go plant this church. He'll have a task list for me, and he'll walk me through it. So he gets back, and then when he comes back into town, he invites me up to his house. And so I was driving this 1990 something Plymouth Breeze that was not in great shape, and so I had a little trouble getting past the guard at the gate. But I made it up to his house, and I knocked on the door, and he opened the door, invited me in, and then he stepped outside of his own house and shut the door, and then he knocked on his own door, and I opened it. I had no idea what was happening. I didn't understand, and then he said, "Hey, so here's what I don't want to have happen. I don't want 2 weeks before the church is supposed to start, for you to come knock on my door and tell me that we're not ready to go." and I drove down out of his neighborhood and thought, oh my goodness, what have I gotten myself into? But he could not have been more encouraging and supportive along the way. And then people like Dave Ferguson came alongside of me and helped me know, okay, here's what you actually need to do. I remember Dave sending me kind of a task list of things like, okay, for the next 9 months, here's what you need to have done, 8 months out, 7 months out, 6 months out. And that was a huge help. So getting connected to a few people like him as a coach made a big difference.
Yeah, and Dave's been a guest on the show as well, and great resources out there. We're working with them right now to plant more churches in California. I don't think our listeners understand what a blessing that was from Dudley, because unfortunately there are pastors out there that want to plant churches, but then they follow that pastor around in the lobby and tell people, yeah, don't go with them, or you can't have these people, they're my best givers or my best friends or whatever. But for Dudley to say, take whoever you want, and start this thing is what made it happen. And it set the DNA for real life, which allowed us to do the same thing, to plant Mission out in Ventura. And we had people go out there and get them started. And, here they are, 10 years old. They baptized 120 people at Easter. And
that's awesome.
They're launching new locations. So that little experience you had there at Dudley's front door, which I always thought it'd be funny if you had just locked him out, but that's for another time. But that really set the DNA for a lot of churches there to make that happen. Well, I'd love to shift gears a little bit here, because you mentioned something that I want to hear about. I don't think I've ever asked you this, but you grew up under a microscope, living in a fishbowl, basically, because in the town of Joplin, which is small and has a Bible college there, Ozark Christian College, which is well known in the community, and a father who was the president of that college, which was well known in the town. He was well known in the town. The name Idleman was well revered in the Christian church and in churches around there. And here you are as, Idleman's son, the son of the president, son of a pastor. How did you live under that microscope? And were there moments you resented it? How did it prepare you for living in a fishbowl now as a pastor of one of the country's largest churches at Southeast?
Yeah, do you remember when I was in high school? I'm sure you wouldn't remember, but I remember coming and staying at the college for a weekend when you were there. And I grew up, around, the students and around the professors in a way that made me really love the school, which helped. Like, I didn't resent it. I didn't resent that at all. And I see now as a pastor with pastors' kids, that if your kids love the church, it goes a long way to helping offset some of the unique challenges of being in the spotlight, being in the fishbowl. But my parents never pressured me in that way. Like, we would have some things, I guess I should say, like when we were in public, we were expected to have a smile on our face for the most part, but I didn't connect that to, who he was or, being in the fishbowl. And when my dad would pray for me at night, like, he would never pray, that I would follow in his footsteps. He never had expectations or pressure that that my life would only be fulfilled if it was in ministry in some way. So I just never felt that pressure from them, and I'm grateful for that. I think I became used to it. So now I don't really think much of it, when I'm in town or running around and people I don't really know stop and talk with me, or, I don't really think much of it. I do think it helps kind of prepare me for that. I think some of the challenges that most pastors' kids have, I had, I needed to find my faith and make it my own. I needed to, work at authenticity and, understand brokenness a little differently. So there were some of those things that I think would be true for most pastors' kids. But my parents just never put a lot of pressure on me to, like, here's what's expected of you. And so I'm grateful for that.
Tell me a little bit more about understand brokenness differently.
One of the things I love the most about being a pastor is being able to meet somebody in a place of brokenness and vulnerability. And that feels like a sacred privilege to me. Like, I love the privilege of that space in people's lives. I think one of the reasons that means so much to me is I avoided that, for, most of my spiritual journey. Like, I didn't necessarily feel like that was safe, or I knew people had expectations, or, I didn't know how to be that way. And so now when the church is that way, it's my favorite thing. It's my favorite thing about being a pastor. But it took me a while, and coming to California helped teach me that. I think part of that is the difference between the Midwest and the West Coast. Being in a church plant allowed me to spend more time with, with people who were broken and had no church. I remember sitting, I remember sitting in this new member class. I don't remember what we called it, but we were meeting after church on a weekend, and everybody was going around and sharing their story. I remember this guy who had taken notes on my sermon, and he had his sermon notes out next to him. And I had been teaching from the book of Acts, and he had written down X. He thought he didn't know the word Acts, didn't know what it meant. And he had written down X every time I had said, some scripture reference from Acts. He thought I was saying Acts. And then he shared his testimony in that group, and kind of his story of brokenness. And he had recently gotten out of an addiction recovery center. And I remember being in that room and watching how, after he did that each person around the table did the same thing. And I began to notice in that group that, if the first person who went was like, had more of a, kind of church background and wasn't very vulnerable, there wasn't much brokenness, and nobody else would either. But if that first person would do it, then everybody else would do it. That there's something really contagious about brokenness, about vulnerability. And it taught me as a pastor to do that intentionally, like to, instead of shying away from that, instead of avoiding it, like I would not only find so much more freedom for my soul, but it would also be an opportunity for other people to discover that as well. But that took me a while. I certainly did not understand that until I was actually serving in the church.
We talk a lot about with our communicators the role of self-disclosure, and when you're teaching, to share a little bit of your own personal pain. And I think, what you just alluded to was sometimes when you come from a background like you or even myself of growing up in the church, you maybe don't have a lot of that kind of, well, I used to ride with Hell's Angels and I killed a man just to watch him die kind of stories. So how do you identify, other than just listening, how do you come across with vulnerability in your teaching without trying to act like, well, I've experienced everything you have, but also relating to people's pain, because at the end of the day, we all have pain. So how have you been able to do that, even though you don't have a lot of those stories? Hey, let me interrupt this episode for just a second. Would you help plant a church today? You can do that in a very simple way. Go to stadiachurchplanting.org today to find out more. All right, back to the show. How have you been able to do that, even though you don't have a lot of those stories?
Well, I think there's two parts to this. One, it's important to not use stories that make it clear that you don't understand it. So let me give you an example. I preached this past weekend on anger, and I should have had a more personal, more vulnerable story in that sermon. Instead, I told this story about moving into our first neighborhood, and the guy's lawn next to me was like immaculate, like no weeds, no dandelions, checkered pattern. And that my wife loved that guy's grass, and I just did not like the guy. I never met him, didn't want to know him, didn't care to get to know him because of his grass. And, and I was making the point in the sermon that I wasn't really mad at him. I was mad at me, that his grass was an indictment on my lack of responsibility. And I finished with that sermon this weekend. And I thought, it was a huge miss. My example of anger was, hey, I'm mad at the guy for having a good yard. So that is a good example of where that's not very vulnerable self-disclosure. But if I could flip that, a few years ago, I told a story about losing my temper and punching a hole in our closet door and covering it up with a mirror and wanting to forget about it and pretend like it never happened. And I got into an argument with my wife about something. I know what it was about, but I don't have permission to say it. And I punched a hole in this door and tried to cover it up. And I was preaching a sermon on grace, and I knew God wanted me to confess that to the church, and I could not shake it. I didn't want to. I was embarrassed by it. I covered it up because I didn't even want my own kids to know I did that. And I told my wife, hey, I think God wants me to share this. I was hoping she would say, no, I don't want you to, because then I get to say, sorry, God, what do you want me to do? I got to honor my wife in this. But she's like, no, if you feel like that's what God wants you to do, then you should do it. And so I got up that weekend and I talked about punching a hole in the wall. And I walked out, didn't want to, but I walked out into the lobby area afterwards. And I had a guy come up to me and tell me his story, a hole in the wall story. And I looked up and there's 6-8 people in line. All of them wanting to share this, all of them of the same gender, by the way.
Of course.
But they all they all had this hole in the wall story. And, it was an incredibly powerful moment. And to this day, like, it's one of the things that people most remember or talk about with me when they talk about a sermon or a story. Like, they remember that moment. And I know the test of vulnerability is sometimes saying something and afterwards thinking, I wish I wouldn't have said that. And so I want to be able to, not every week, but on a regular basis, listen to a sermon and think, I wish I wouldn't have said that. Like, it felt like a little too much. I just think very rarely do we go too much. That's at least true with my generation. Maybe the younger generation needs different guardrails because they're more comfortable with it. But for me, I rarely would step over the line, and I probably needed to more often on that. How do you coach your guys?
I think that we talk a lot about what's the root behind it all. What's a lot of times it is pride, or it's anger, or it's worry, or approval addiction. Okay, we can all relate to that, even if we haven't done the certain things. But I totally agree. I mean, the things that people still talk about around here are, the time I talked about my brother-in-law, who I hated, and how I dealt with that. How I, did the wrong thing at a red light versus the right thing. You're right. Those moments that we pushed it a little further, and we felt uncomfortable, but it was good. I wonder if 10 years from now, people in our line of work will be talking about, well, how do you not share so much?
Yeah.
Because you're now losing credibility with your audience. It seems to be this pendulum that swings back and forth. One of the unique things about your story is that you planted a church, but you also took over a church, and you followed not just one legend, but two. And for those that don't know the history of Southeast, I mean, Bob Russell is a rock star in the Christian church world, in the church world, and was there for 40 years and did an incredible job and built this amazing organization, but had his eye on transition 20 years prior and brought in this great young kid named Dave Stone, who grew into be this great senior pastor to take over from him. And the transition was seamless, and it was well documented and studied and kind of the worlds we live in. But then they identified you to be the next guy. So here you are going to be the third in line. And the transition went incredibly smooth. What did they do right? Because a lot of churches right now are trying to figure out how to transition, and it doesn't often go that well.
Yeah, I think Bob brought Dave into that role and began to share a lot of not just the preaching, but the leadership with him at a time where that was really unusual. And nowadays, you see guys who will do that more often because they want to share the load. Like, they don't want to preach every weekend, and they're living a healthier, balanced life, right? That wasn't why Bob brought Dave in. Like, Bob would have been glad to preach every weekend.
Yeah.
Like that. That's not why he brought him in, because he recognized that for the health of the church, the good of the church, that it needed to not just be around a personality. Like, he understood that. I think maybe the church was around 4,000 at that time, and he understood that it would be healthier for the church if it was a shared platform. And so that value made for a much more seamless, and it wasn't seamless, but a much more seamless transition, down the road, because that was the motivation for it initially. It was and then Bob and Dave both transitioned out at, I'll get this wrong, but like it's 61 and 59, something like that. They both easily could have gone another 4, 5, 6, 7 years, and would have had a lot of pressure to do that. Their peers and the leadership in the church for both of those guys would have encouraged them and pushed them. Hey, it's too soon, it's too early. But they both recognize, that's the time to do this. And I know that's not true for everyone, but I do think that was a significant reason why the transitions have gone really healthy, is they didn't wait until everyone's thinking, when's it going to be? They transitioned out during a time that was earlier than most people would have expected. One of the things that Dave did for me is he almost immediately, when he became senior pastor, he almost immediately started having me preach half the time. And he made me an elder with him, which in our leadership structure was a pretty significant statement to the rest of the church and to the staff. So there's only two staff people that would have been elders, just him and myself. So, those things were very strategic. He knew what it was like to be in my seat and in my position. I benefited from that greatly. Our friendship was and is very real, which, that goes a long way. I always knew he was, in my corner. I always knew he was, cheering me on. And I always felt that way towards him. There were a lot of things we would have done different. There are plenty of things where I would have thought, or I would think to myself, yeah, that's not how I would do it. But I always had tremendous respect for him and, wanted him to do really well. So I was, that humility from both of them. I just can't say enough about that. That was very real and authentic, and I would have left a long time ago had it not been.
What's interesting about watching you over the years is I've always known you could teach. You're a gifted communicator. You always have been, even back in the old days. I listened to a lot of your messages in the early days of Real Life because remember the cassette ministry that would have set up out there in the lobby? Well, I got all of those tapes and they eventually became CDs. That was a huge step for us to transition to that. And I listened to a lot of those because coming into Real Life, I wanted to know what were they used to? What do they listen to? You were a great teacher at 22 and now at 42 or however old you are. It's not surprising you continue to get better and your teaching, your videos, all that. This is great. But I've really been impressed with your leadership instincts. And I know you have a team around you and they help you. But what has helped your leadership development the most? Was it watching other leaders? Was it having a team around you that sharpens some of the things? Do you find that you yield more than you direct? What is your leadership style and how has it developed over the years?
One of my favorite definitions of preaching, I don't know who said this, but it's truth through personality. It's God's truth through who he made you to be. I have discovered that's also one of my favorite definitions for leadership and for writing is that it's truth through personality. It's being who you are, God's truth through who you are, through who he made you. And I'm really thankful that Bob gave me freedom to figure that out when I was in my mid-20s. He would say, I felt plenty of pressure, to do things the way they did it. And but that didn't come from them. And Bob would say to me, we need you to be you. You don't, the church doesn't need another me. The church doesn't need another Dave. The church needs you to be you. And I grew into that. Like I don't think I really understood that for a while. But I have discovered that that's where I'm most effective. Doesn't mean I don't have parts of me that need to grow, dramatically, but I don't need to try to be somebody else. And I was reading, I think I'll get the title right here, 8 Paradoxes of a Leader. Mm-hmm. And he goes through these leadership qualities. And as he's going through those, I'm like, so encouraging to me because there are things that I might have said 15 years ago were some of my weaknesses. And now I see them as a strength. Like I thought they were weakness because they were different than some of the leaders I really looked up to. And I thought, man, if I'm going to lead, I need to be more of a choleric like Bob, and I need to be more sanguine like Dave. And I wasn't either of those things. And trying to be is exhausting. So that that confidence and that peace of, hey, I want to grow. I want to continue to challenge myself and be aware of my weaknesses. But I want to be true to who God made me.
So define for us your personality.
Well, I don't know. I don't like personality tests. Well, whatever people say, what Enneagram number are you? And I'm like, whatever Enneagram doesn't like Enneagram, like whatever the personality test is, it doesn't.
That'd be an 8.
Personality test.
Well, you strike me as somebody who, even though you stand on a stage and talk, you are an introvert. You seem to be rather thoughtful rather than speak first and figure it out later. You don't seem to process verbally. It's more internal. Am I getting any of this right?
Let me interrupt for just a moment. Did you know we have a YouTube channel? In fact, all of our podcasts are now recorded and placed on YouTube as well. So ever wanted to look at the person I'm talking to? Now you can. Go to Pastor Rusty George on YouTube and subscribe. All right, back to our show.
Yeah, you're good. So the introvert extrovert scale, I compare myself to introverts that are hyper introverts. I won't mention any names, but other people that you and I know and love. And I'm like, well, I'm not that, I don't think. And then I compare myself to people who are hyper extroverts, and I'm like, well, I'm not that. I definitely, enjoy some time to myself. So I don't know that I've found kind of the camp that I feel most comfortable in. Well, here's an example of this. As a pastor, I love meeting with people on the weekends. I just don't like to stand around and shake hands and small talk. So I'll meet with people before and after services. I'll meet with anybody in the church, and so before church and after, I'll sit down, talk to 2 or 3 people, 15, 20 minutes at a time, be able to listen to them and pray for them. And I really love that. Like that has been incredibly life-giving for me. I don't necessarily want to just go sit in a room somewhere by myself. I really enjoy sitting down and being able to have, that kind of conversation with someone in the church. But yeah, how would you describe yourself? It's a hard question.
Well, I kind of came prepared for this because I've been trying to figure that out for the last few years.
Okay.
And I think the better part of my life was, when you're in your 20s, you're just replicating what your Bible college professors did.
Yeah.
Then in your 30s, you're trying to replicate whoever the hottest preachers are right now.
Good.
And I think now that I'm in, I'm 50. I'm not in my 50s. I'm 50. At the time this airs, I'll be 51. But I think I'm kind of more comfortable in my skin, and the term I like to use is whimsical. It's easy for me to make a joke out of most anything, and I used to think that was a weakness, but now I think, that's just who I am. And I find that the way I relate to a lot of people when I teach on the weekend is when I just make an offhanded comment about an 80s song or a movie or what might be going on in this text, and people lean in. It's a level of authenticity that I have. So like you said, I've tried to embrace that rather than, when I first got here, I'm trying to be Kyle, and then I was trying to be, whoever the hottest preacher was down the street, and now just to, I'm not the deepest, most thoughtful person you've ever met, but I am whimsical, and I'll try to make it simple for you, and that's my personality. So that's my best shot at it.
Yeah, well, and it's freeing to discover that. In the middle of COVID, I had a friend of mine say, "Hey, I think you should go talk to this." I've never already told you this. I think you should go talk to this life coach, executive coach. That's what he called him, an executive coach. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? I could use an executive coach. Like there was something about that felt, I don't know.
Felt appropriate.
Yeah, I was like,
I should do that.
It appealed to my ego in some way, I think, and so I line up this guy to as an executive coach, and I get maybe 45 minutes into the first session with him, and I'm like, oh, he's a therapist. Like, he is clearly, like, he calls himself an executive coach. So people like me will go meet with him. And so I started, meeting with him on a weekly basis. And I found it to be incredibly helpful to, better understanding some of these things, better understanding who God made me, and how I need to honor that so that I can do what He's called me to do for the long haul, and not wear myself out too quickly.
Oh, it's a great word. I always love it when our guests talk about their therapists or executive coach. Yes. Because we all need it. We need to talk to somebody. Okay, this has been awesome. But I really want to talk to you about your writing, because at some point early on, you decided, I need to write. What led you to writing? Because that's not something that's easy to do.
Yeah, I didn't know that I wanted to do that. I'd always manuscripted my sermons for the most part. Typically, if I preach, I'll write out like 3,500 words, and then I'll preach around 5,000. It's typically my spoken word count. So the majority of my sermon I would write out. So I enjoyed the writing process, and yet I didn't have much of a thought around writing a book. Not because I wouldn't have enjoyed doing it, but just because I felt like there was a lot of books out there. I didn't feel like I had a lot to add to the conversation. One of the reasons I love the God's truth through personality as a writer is because I've learned that God uses different voices differently, in the same way He uses churches and communicators. But I had finished preaching a series, I don't know how long ago this was, maybe 11 or 12 years ago, at church called Not a Fan. And I had a guy in our church who at the time was like some kind of vice president of marketing. I'll get the title wrong, at Zondervan, a publishing company. And he said, when I was done with that series, he said, "Hey, if you turn that into a book, I think I can get it published for you." And it kind of took my excuses off the table to do something like that, because I thought about it, but just, I did not have I just couldn't imagine writing it and then trying to send it out and doing all of that. So he took that off the table for me, Don Gates, who and so I wrote Not a Fan, and God's timing was so good, because at that time I was thinking about going and doing something different. I couldn't see myself staying in the role I was in for the next 10 or 12 years. And then God opened up that door for writing and for some production work. Mm-hmm. And I loved doing that for that season. I still do some of that, but He opened up that door. But if sort of a Christ Church of Perseverance scenario,
author,
God kind of took away my excuses, and I discovered that I really love it.
Okay, so Not a Fan is your most successful book, but I've discovered books are like kids. Some, you just have a different connection with. What's your favorite book that you've written?
I think it's important for people to recognize that the publishing world is a crapshoot. Like,
yes,
you don't have any, like some of the best books out there you'll never know about because they don't ever really get off the ground. And some of the books that aren't really very good at all just take off and you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
And so, as an author, I've learned to kind of accept the reality of that and trust that, you do this as a stewardship, as an offering to God, and He uses it however He wants. My favorite book that I've written was probably a book called The End of Me, which may have done worse than any other book. I don't really know the exact numbers, but I bet it did. I bet that's a true statement. But it was probably my favorite one that I wrote.
That's really interesting. I know that my favorite one was one that no one read but my mother. But I felt like, that's me. And a great point about that, because, and I think it was Don Gates that told me this. Publishers look at it as, out of 10 books that they publish from different authors, 5 will be dreadful 4 will be okay, and 1 will be so successful it will pay for all the rest of them.
Yeah.
I've always been in the 5 that are dreadful, apparently. So, but
well, what's frustrating?
Thanks for paying for it with not a fan.
It's frustrating. I've maybe written, I don't know, 8 or 9 books, and it's frustrating to feel like you get better at it.
Yeah.
but the numbers don't necessarily reflect
right.
it. So I blame the reader.
Exactly. If you guys could read what I'm writing now, it's so much better than the early days. Okay, well, your latest book is called One at a Time. Where'd this idea come from?
When I came from real life to Southeast, it's really came from that season. I was really overwhelmed when I first came to this church by how many people there were, and it was very easy for me to just stay up in my office and go to meetings. And I found about 6 months into it, I think I even talked to you around this time, about 6 months into it, I was pretty disillusioned with all of it, and thought maybe I'd made a mistake and wasn't sure what God wanted me to do. And I was reading the narrative from Luke 8 of the woman with the issue of blood who reaches out and touches the hem of Jesus, and she tries to disappear into the crowd. Mm-hmm. And then there's this really beautiful verse there as Jesus is looking for her, where it says, seeing that she could not go unnoticed. Mm-hmm. And when I read that, it something clicked for me about ministry, that my calling as a pastor was to make sure that people couldn't go unnoticed, that the one person who's trying to kind of hide in the crowd gets seen. And I don't feel like I'm really good at that, by the way. Like, I don't feel like that comes naturally. I don't, from a personality standpoint, that's not you. If you spend time with me, you don't think, oh, he's that guy. Like, it really takes some work, but I love it. And I began to work at looking at ministry and calling through that lens, that one at a time lens, and become a collector of stories. And then I started to look through, the Gospels and just recognize how many narratives are one at a time narratives. Like that's how Jesus did ministry. Mm. And then I saw within our church just the opportunity to lead in that way, where the more campuses we had and the more people who attended, the more that value of Jesus needed to be emphasized. And so I began to more intentionally to lead as a pastor with that value. And we put together this app called One at a Time, and I have people from our church share stories, kind of their one at a time stories on there. And it is incredibly inspiring because you just see the power where thousands of people are living out their faith 1% at a time. And it's not necessarily super dramatic, but that's kind of what I love about it. Mm-hmm. They're learning and I'm learning to see those everyday opportunities as gospel opportunities. And so, recognizing that, like, as a church, if we can unleash that within our church, like, our opportunity for influence and impact is profound. I also would say that as a pastor, I know what it is to get caught up in, like, the numbers of things, like, how many copies of a book is sold, or how many people attend, or how many baptisms we had, and how many followers on social media. And it's not to say that some of those numbers aren't important. I mean, they are, but that's not how you want to measure your influence. Like, we use the word influencer that way. It's like, well, how many people do you have, that are following you or commenting or sharing your posts or whatever it is. And I just reject that. Like, I really tried hard to not, just to not have any space for that. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't tell you, like, I couldn't tell you how many people we have and somebody is paying attention to that. I just know for me, I just don't need to go there. Like, it's just, that would not be the path that would be healthy for me as a pastor, as a leader. And so, and so it really came out of that, just watching how that, when my life reflects that, when I feel like I can tell one at a time gospel stories, then I'm much healthier in ministry. When I feel like I can't tell those stories, I don't have much to say, and I don't have much energy to say it.
That's really well said. I think we've all struggled with the numbers. They become a god to us. They become an idol. When they're good, we think, oh, that's fantastic. When they're bad, we're at our wits' end. I remember a few years ago, I decided I need to fast from the numbers, and I fasted for a few years.
Okay.
And then another pastor, a mutual friend of ours, said to me, you got to look at them sometime because you kind of need to know how to steer the ship. And so I've found quarterly is a pretty good time just to take a look at things.
That's good.
Because eventually you just start, if you have a bad weekend, then you think, I'll fix it next weekend. Well, the people that weren't there will be here and vice versa. So, hey, this has been so rich, and it's just been fun to talk to you. You're going to be out our way this summer, and I cannot wait for that experience to have you back at Real Life, first time in the building, so that'll be fun.
Yeah.
Maybe that weekend we'll just go back to the theater, so you can just have that experience again.
Let's not do that.
For all of our listeners who think, I'd like to get a copy of, One at a Time, but more importantly, I'd like to share that with others. You have great resources out there for churches to utilize this. How can they find all this, and what's the best next step for them?
You can probably just go into my website, kyleidleman.com. There's a bunch of resources on there, and that'd probably be the best place to go.
Okay. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for what you did at Real Life. Thank you for leaving Real Life because it allowed me to get here. But thank you for what you're doing for the kingdom, because it is really massive, and it's really great, and it's really personal through One at a Time. So I appreciate it, buddy.
Thanks, brother. Great to talk to you.
Well, thanks so much for listening. I think that you got a lot out of that, just as I did. I so appreciate Kyle being on the program. If you would you leave a review, and we will read it. In fact, we are collecting all the reviews that are being listed over the course of the summer, and we're going to draw out of that list of reviews a winner and give an incredible prize to. So stay tuned for that. Let me read one right now. This comes from BL Schools. Brittany writes, "You should subscribe. I welcome this podcast into my latest episode folder. I always look forward to listening. It's helped me as a leader, and I have shared lots of episodes with friends in vocational ministry and some who are not. So thank you, Brittany. Really appreciate that. And you, too, can be entered into this contest by leaving a review wherever you get your podcast. So thanks so much for listening. Next week, we'll be back with brand new content, and my old buddy Brad Williams is back, and we have a discussion about simple leadership lessons for the summer. So can't wait to talk to you then.
Take a moment and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get it delivered every week. And subscribe to the Rusty George YouTube channel for more devotionals, messages, and fun videos. Thank you for listening to Leading Simple.